One of these short stories was written by a best-selling author. The other was 100% AI generated. I'm a book editor, and I'm going to critique them side by side. Whether we like it or not, AI models are generating fiction. A survey published earlier this year revealed that many writers use generative AI in some part of their process. And there have even been books published with remnants of AI prompts included in the text. Yikes. But what does AI-written fiction actually look and sound like? What are the signs that a story was written by AI? And the uncomfortable question, is AI-written fiction any good? To answer these questions, best-selling author Curtis Sittenfeld did an experiment with the New York Times last year, where both she and ChatGPT wrote a 1,000-word short story about lust, regret, and kissing. The ChatGPT prompt said to write it in the style of Curtis Sittenfeld, and Curtis revealed that she's one of many authors whose work has been used to train LLMs without her permission. Putting a human-written story next to an AI-generated one tells us a lot about what AI is and isn't capable of when it comes to fiction. And even as someone who edits fiction for a living, I doubted myself a couple of times. Here's a problem I'm noticing when it comes to the discussion of identifying AI writing. A lot of the criteria people have been listing don't necessarily apply one-to-one to creative writing, including things like overuse of em-dashes. I myself am an enthusiastic user of em-dashes, and ChatGPT will not be taking them away from me. Putting things in opposition. It's not blank, it's blank. Weird imagery that doesn't make sense, and listing things in threes. These things can be super helpful for identifying AI-generated tweets or blogs, but we cannot rely on them alone when it comes to detecting fiction written by AI, especially as models evolve to potentially not use these patterns anymore. So I think the best way to learn what AI-written fiction sounds like is to read it. So let's see whether we can tell which of these short stories was written by ChatGPT. As I read through each of these stories, I'll give you my immediate reactions and thoughts. Here's the first one, called You Probably Can See Where This Is Going. When my flight from LaGuardia landed in Minneapolis on that August afternoon, okay, already I'm noting that opening with a plane landing in a new location is a bit of an overused cliche. But I'll continue. The first text I received was from the executive director of the nonprofit I'd be holding the training for the next day, canceling our dinner because of a family emergency. The second text was from my friend Jenny, asking me to look at the profile of a guy named James on the dating app we both used, and to let her know if it was the same ask not one question James I'd gone out with around Christmas. I like the phrasing asked not one question James. That feels unexpected and unique to me, not necessarily something AI would probably come up with. That date had felt like such a waste of an evening that I'd given myself a break from the app since. By the time the seatbelt light had gone off, I'd texted Jenny to tell her it wasn't, and I'd received a heart on the app from a man who was currently online, whose handle was Mountain Biker 1971. He was 53, a year younger than me. He had deep brown eyes and was bald with a gray and brown beard, and 3 of his 5 photos featured him on a bike. I noticed there are 2 semicolons in this sentence, which is not something I often see in AI-generated text. I swear that Mountain Biker 1971 and I had already exchanged generic greetings before it occurred to me that because my settings showed profiles within 10 miles of me, he was local. The repetition of I swear is also standing out to me here. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but it's interesting. Oh, sorry, I typed. Just realized you live in Minnesota and I'm only visiting for 36 hours. Note the abbreviation of hours. I'm not sure ChatGPT would do that. Before I could send this, a new message came in from him. What's your favorite fruit that's considered a vegetable? And what's your best episode of TV ever? So I deleted oh sorry and typed okra and the season finale of Severance. You? Can you see where this is going? You probably can see where this is going. Now, this break in POV feels human to me because it's jarring and quite unexpected. In a short story written in first person, we don't usually see the narrator break the fourth wall and address the reader directly, so I'm not sure ChatGPT would come up with an experimental line like this. Also, I like that this line harkens back to the title. By the time I was in an Uber, he'd told me his name was Brian. He worked for an environmental advocacy group, and the previous weekend on a trail, he'd ridden his bike past a woodpecker sitting on the back of a deer. He'd been so close that he and the deer had made eye contact. There's another semicolon. I typed, just to clarify, you did or didn't also make eye contact with the woodpecker. I really like this banter here, which also feels like a human wrote it, I think. Sadly, no, he replied. Next time? By the time I'd entered my hotel room, he'd written, I don't usually suggest it this quickly, but want to grab a drink tonight? So far, I'd answered no question untruthfully. When he'd said he lived in St. Paul, I typed, I'm currently in downtown Minneapolis. I hesitated for a few seconds, then typed, I'm free tonight. Then there's a line break. I'm not sure ChatGPT would do a line break, but what do I know? The Uber let me out about 100 feet from Lake Como, and I walked toward the pavilion. A band Brian liked was performing at 7, and when I'd admitted I'd never been to Como Park, he'd replied, You're not one of those Minneapolis people with a superiority complex over St. Paul, are you? I'd written, Nope, my superiority complex is for totally different reasons. Here's more of that banter, which I like and feels genuine. Outside the pavilion's restaurant, I spotted a bearded bald guy, another semicolon. He wore a blue t-shirt, jeans, and flip-flops. From a few feet away, I said, Brian? And he raised his eyebrows and said, Cassie? Should we hug? I asked, and he smiled such a warm and sincere-seeming smile that even though I'd been on far too many mediocre dates for extravagant optimism, I was gripped by extravagant optimism. Yes, he said, we should. We stepped into each other's arms. Online for beers, I felt as if I were on a reality show about middle-aged Manhattan women who traveled to Minnesota to go on dates with hot, outdoorsy, middle-aged men. Then we carried our drinks outside. I rarely drank beer, but it seemed Midwestern, and all the picnic tables were full, so we walked along the lake until we found an empty bench. There's the first use of em dashes in this story, which people often say is a tell of AI writing, but I think it works here and could just as easily be human. It was 70 degrees, the sunlight was golden, and the trees were lushly green. Why didn't I live in Minnesota? Now, this description of the sunlight being golden and the trees lushly green feels a bit generic, and I would expect something a bit more specific or surprising from a human writer. We discussed where we'd grown up, me in DC, him in Duluth, our jobs. I refrained from mentioning my employer's location, and our first marriages. His had lasted 13 years, mine 21. This formatting is interesting because I don't see a lot of parentheses in AI writing. When he casually asked, and what year did you move here? I hesitated before blurting out 2019. I really almost never lied, in life or on dates, and I deeply regretted the necessity. Both to change the subject and because it was true, I gestured toward the multiple pedal boats out on the lake, whose prows were shaped like the heads of swans, and said, Is it cheesy to say I love those? It's cheesy, he said, but in a good way. This line caught me by surprise because up to this point, the characters have had such an interesting and engaging banter, but here he just says something approving, so the tone feels a bit more flat. He glanced at his watch. The band is starting, though. The band! It turned out to be a David Bowie cover band, a fact I'd hardly paid attention to amid the spontaneity, excitement, and growing deceit. As we entered the upper level of the pavilion, I could hear the opening notes of Golden Years, and I saw 6 people on stage. The lead singer, a woman with long blonde hair wearing a baby blue suit and a white tie. The pavilion was packed with people of all ages, some already dancing by the stage and others sitting on rickety benches and folding lawn chairs. This is a really nice description of the scene, but does pique my spidey senses a little bit. I feel like sometimes AI has the tendency to over-describe things that we actually don't need to draw our eye to at any given moment, so this maybe feels a little bit on the cusp of that. As Golden Years segued into changes, Brian angled his head toward the dance floor, and I nodded. As I learned over the next several songs, he was proficient in his head bobbing and sidestepping without trying too hard or too little, which was probably the best I could hope anyone would say about me. Then I was dancing with 2 octogenarian women wearing button-down shirts, fanny packs, and tivas. Then with an androgynous, aqua-haired 20-something who wore a cropped black tank top and showed abundant armpit hair whenever they threw their arms up. Then with 2 little girls and their dad. Here we have another long sentence strung together with semicolons, which creates this interesting moment of pacing where we feel swept into the moment and the dancing along with the characters. I don't know that ChatGPT would stylize the text in this way to have this effect. Whenever I turned away from the band, I could see the sun setting over the lake. By the last song, the sun was down. After the final applause, as the crowd dispersed, Brian said, "Swan boat time?" The boat rental did not, apparently, stop at dark. The boats could be illuminated so that the swans glowed, and their glowing reflections were mirrored in the water. When we were in the middle of the lake, I said, "I feel like I'm inside a fairy tale." "Yeah?" Brian turned his head to look at me. "Which one?" If I turned my head, I knew we'd kiss. I'm still trying to figure that out, I said, and I turned my head toward him. This moment maybe feels a tad on the nose and a bit of a romantic cliche, especially with her saying it feels like she's in a fairy tale. But let's keep going and see where the story goes. He offered to drive me home, but of course I declined. We made out more as we waited for my Uber, though, and when it arrived, he said, "I'd love to see you again." The mention of them making out more feels a little abrupt because we didn't even know they made out in the first place, just that they kissed. Maybe I would expect to be more in the moment in the character's mind as they're making out here. Same, I said. From the car, I texted Jenny. This is so weird, but I just had a perfect first date. 10 seconds later, my phone rang. Perfect how? I went out with him impulsively, as a lark, then I accidentally really liked him. He was great, and we drank beer and danced sweatily. Is sweatily a real word? But I never told him I'm just in town for work, so now I ghost him, right? Because even though ghosting is horrible, what else am I supposed to do? Retroactively ruin things? When Jenny sighed, the sigh was somehow affectionate. If you ghost him, she said, it's definitely the end. But if you tell him the truth, maybe it's the beginning. And that's the end. What I really like about this ending is it doesn't tie things up neatly in a bow. We don't actually know what the protagonist ends up doing, if she ghosts him or if she texts him again. So I like that it's open-ended. This story felt human written to me, but hopefully I'll know for certain once I read the other one. Let me pull it up. Why am I nervous all of a sudden? The second story is called The Flip-Flop Moment. Lydia had always been practical. Interesting, this one is in third person, whereas the first story was in first person. It was her hallmark, the trait that kept her life organized in neat rows, like the files on her desk or the cushions on her sofa. At 48, this practicality had become her armor, protecting her from the reckless impulses that she might have indulged in during her younger years. And so, when she walked into the coffee shop on that sweltering July afternoon, it was with the same cautious optimism that she had applied to everything else in her life. I wish I knew more about these impulses that Lydia is trying to keep at bay. And I'm not really sure what this cautious optimism has to do with when we were talking about her practicality. Those feel like two different things. Also, what does being practical have to do with her entering the coffee shop to begin with? The coffee shop was called Java Junction, an ironic nod to its nondescript location. It was where she met her friends for book club, where she studied with her son while he was in high school, and where she'd spent countless hours with her late husband. So here, there's an opportunity to really develop the setting, at least tell us what city or state we're in, but we get none of that. We have no idea where this Java Junction is geographically. That kind of makes me feel like this is ChatGPT, whereas the other story was very specifically set in Minnesota. That was the first thing she'd felt when she'd entered, the lingering echo of shared memories. Okay, this phrasing feels like the type of flowery but empty language that ChatGPT loves. I have no idea what those lingering memories really are. There's no substance there. She was here for a meeting with her college friend Julie, and Julie was late, which gave Lydia plenty of time to observe. What's the meeting for? What's it about? What are the stakes? We have no context. She sat at a small table near the window, which was always Lydia's favorite spot. The sunlight spilled over the table, creating a halo around her as she skimmed through a magazine, her flip-flops occasionally brushing the edge of the table. She had never been one for extravagant shoes. Practical again. There's the first use of an M-dash. But it feels okay here. But on that day, the flip-flops seemed to betray a different side of her, a side that wanted to feel something more, something less anchored. This line feels quite forced. Is wearing flip-flops really a sign of wanting to feel something more? Also, by this point, we're losing a sense of what we're reading for. We have no idea what their meeting is even about or what's at stake emotionally for Lydia. There seems to be some kind of inner conflict she's dealing with, but we have no idea what it's all about. Julie arrived, panting slightly from the heat. She was a whirlwind of energy, always dressed in vibrant colors and speaking in rapid bursts. This is the classic example of telling us about a character rather than showing us. It would be more effective to simply describe what she's wearing and show that she has a vibrant outfit on, or show her dialogue, and then that will convey her enthusiasm and excitement. The two friends embraced, and Lydia noticed how the decades had changed them both. Julie still had that unfiltered joy, while Lydia felt a certain grayness to her own existence. I kind of like the phrase grayness to one's existence. I feel like I can comprehend what that might feel like, though I still don't know why Lydia feels that way. They talked about their lives, Julie's recent move to a beach town and Lydia's endless workdays, the responsibilities of being a single mother, the growing distance from her teenage son. They laughed about old times and reminisced about their college days, and for a moment, Lydia felt something she hadn't felt in a while, a spark of connection, of vitality. Okay, rather than showing any of the dialogue between the two friends, we're getting it all via this summary language. This is in stark contrast to the first story, where we saw the dialogue both with the narrator and her friend and her date. That allowed us to understand their dynamics by seeing them play out in real time, versus here, we're just being told what they talked about without actually seeing the content of their conversation. This feels very ChatGPT to me. As they chatted, Lydia noticed a man sitting alone at a nearby table. He was tall, with an easy smile, and eyes that seemed to dance with mischief. He wore a pair of flip-flops, practical, but worn with a casual confidence. Lydia couldn't help but glance at him every now and then, her gaze lingering longer than she intended. Once again, we're getting no specifics on what is actually attracting Lydia to this guy, and you are not going to convince me she's attracted to him because of his flip-flops. After all, what woman is attracted to a man wearing flip-flops? It really feels at this point like the story is trying to make the flip-flops symbolic of something, like that's the connection between Lydia and this guy, but it just is not making any sense. Julie, ever observant, caught Lydia's eyes darting toward the man and laughed. "You've got that look, Lydia." Lydia flushed slightly, but tried to play it off. What look? You know, the look of someone who's thinking about doing something impulsive. Go talk to him. Lydia shook her head, though her curiosity was piqued. I don't think so. But the man, sensing perhaps that he was being observed, caught Lydia's eye and smiled. It was a warm, inviting smile, and Lydia felt a flutter in her chest. Okay, here we have some cliché language, a warm, inviting smile, and a flutter in her chest. She looked away quickly, pretending to examine her coffee cup, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. There's another cliché phrase, the heat rising in her cheeks. Julie, however, had no such qualms. What's the worst that could happen? You go over, say hello, and if it's awkward, you just come back. It's not like you're trying to get married. Lydia hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, she felt the tug of familiarity and routine. On the other, she felt the irresistible pull of something unknown, something that reminded her of her own lost desires. Lydia's internal conflict continues to feel incredibly vague. We have no idea what exactly she's so torn about. Why is it so high stakes for her to potentially talk to this guy? What does she have to gain or lose? Fine, she said, laughing nervously. I'll do it. Julie's grin widened as Lydia stood up, her flip-flops, there are the flip-flops again, slapping against the floor with each step. She approached the man, her heart pounding in her ears. Excuse me, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I hope you don't mind me bothering you, but I couldn't help but notice your flip-flops. They're kind of carefree. Okay, what the heck is happening here? What woman in her right mind would go up to a man wearing flip-flops, first off, but go up to him and then comment on said flip-flops and say they look carefree? The story is really losing me here. The man looked up, his eyes twinkling. There's some more cliché language. I suppose they are. I'm David, by the way. This moment feels so cringy to me, because why is he being so genuine about the flip-flops? The former story had that banter between the love interests, and here it's just so serious, which doesn't feel true to life. I'm Lydia, she said, extending her hand, which David took with a warm, firm grip. They talked, the conversation flowing easily. David was charming and engaging, with a disarming honesty that Lydia found refreshing. They spoke about their lives, their interests, and the little quirks that made them unique. For a while, Lydia forgot about her practical life and lost herself in the moment. Here's more of that summary language that tells us absolutely nothing. What are their interests? What are their backgrounds? What are they sharing about their lives? What are their little quirks besides their shared love of flip-flops, apparently? We're not seeing the specifics of their dialogue, so we have no understanding of the actual content of their conversation and therefore their connection. It was only when the conversation began to dwindle and David suggested they meet again that Lydia felt a pang of regret. She was in her 40s, a mother, a widow. What was she doing? Flirting with a stranger in a coffee shop? Maybe, Lydia said, trying to sound nonchalant, I should get back to my friend. David looked disappointed but smiled. Of course, it was lovely meeting you, Lydia. As Lydia walked back to her table, she glanced over her shoulder to see David watching her, a hopeful expression on his face. Julie looked up at her, eyes twinkling with mischief. Eyes twinkling was already used above, and I'm pretty sure mischief was also used earlier. There it is, when she's describing the guy for the first time, his eyes that seemed to dance with mischief. So overusing this same phrasing is really starting to feel like AI. Human authors definitely have pet phrases and overuse the same phrasing, but I feel like that would be caught in rounds of editing. That wasn't so bad, was it? Julie asked. Lydia smiled weakly. No, it wasn't. But the encounter had stirred something within her, a mix of excitement and apprehension. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been on the brink of something that might have changed her life. This is a lot of words, but isn't really saying anything. And as she left the coffee shop later, her flip-flops felt unusually heavy, as though they were holding her back from taking a step into the unknown. Once again, the story is drawing our attention to the flip-flops, and I really don't know why, because I'm not understanding why it's trying to use the flip-flops as some kind of motif. The days that followed were filled with a mix of longing and regret. Lydia found herself thinking about David more often than she cared to admit, replaying their conversation, analyzing every detail. Now we're summarizing a long period of time rather than getting immersed in a specific scene where Lydia weighs the pros and cons of talking to the guy again. She had never been one for regret, but this time it gnawed at her, a small, persistent itch that she couldn't scratch. This feels like the narrative is explicitly telling us what Lydia feels rather than showing us that regret via a scene or via an action she takes or doesn't take. It feels like it's naming the emotion too on the nose. Eventually, she realized that the flip-flop moment wasn't just about David or the possibility of a new romance. It was about her own desire for change, for something different from the routine she had built. The encounter had awakened something inside her, a recognition of the parts of herself that had been buried under layers of practicality and duty. This turning point isn't resonating because we don't understand what actually happened internally or externally to make Lydia have this big, profound revelation. And so, with a mixture of courage and trepidation, Lydia decided to embrace the unexpected. She reached out to David, sending a simple message that read, "If you're still interested, I'd love to continue our conversation." This would be a moment to bring us back into the physical scene with details of where Lydia is and what she's doing as she's texting David, but we get none of that scene setting. As she hit send, Lydia felt a sense of liberation, a small step toward reclaiming the parts of herself she had put on hold. She knew that whatever happened next, she was ready to face it, flip-flops and all. Of course, the flip-flops have to come back one last time, just in case we forgot. Now, the story is somewhat open-ended because, of course, we don't know how David responds, but it does feel more generally resolved than the first story. So what do you think? Which one was AI written? I'm not sure how surprising this will be, but ChatGPT wrote the second story. But the biggest giveaways that the story was written by AI had nothing to do with em dashes or listing things in 3. It felt AI written because it was hollow and empty. You read it and feel nothing. Curtis herself said the ChatGPT story was, quote, "so boring that I wouldn't have finished reading it if I hadn't agreed to this assignment." And she acknowledged that it is proficient on a sentence level, but cliched, and also shallow in sentiment. And she said it felt like the literary equivalent of fat-free cookies or a Ken doll's genitals, which are comparisons I love. If I had to create a set of criteria for detecting AI-written fiction specifically, this would be it. AI-written fiction feels vague and placeless in setting, identifies feelings and themes too explicitly, tells and summarizes rather than shows in specificity, resolves things neatly, and relies on generalizations and cliches. I keep thinking back to the details that made Curtis's story come alive on the page. The Minneapolis setting, the reference to Severance, the playful banter, the David Bowie cover band. I couldn't tell you one detail from the AI-written story besides the freaking flip-flops. Now, this article was published in August 2024, so it's possible ChatGPT would generate a more sophisticated story today. And I'm sure that the second story could be made better through revision or prompts that make it more specific. But ultimately, what gives a story life is injecting our humanity into it, our specific, messy, raw experiences that are so personal and individual, yet also somehow universal. None of us know what AI is going to be capable of in the future, but I do truly believe that human-told stories will always matter. So what do you think about this story and AI-generated fiction in general? Tell me in the comments. And if you missed my deep dive into the survey of how many writers are using generative AI today, watch that video here. There's a lot to unpack. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.